Darkness and Starlight. Chapter 1. South Figaro. The soldier wore heavy gloves, and he held nothing back when he struck her across the jaw and then slammed his fist into her stomach, knocking the wind from her. The corners of her vision reddened. She would have doubled over, if not for the chains around her wrists keeping her upright. She gasped to fill her empty lungs, while the guard laughed and then spat at her bare, blistered feet.
"Traitorous scum,"
he leered.
"The great General Celes, pride of the Empire. Look at you now. You'll be dead at dawn."
Had it been that long already? Her cell was some sort of basement storeroom converted hastily for this purpose. There were still crates of goods in the far corner. The only light came from a swaying lantern. No sign or scent of the outdoors to give her a clue as to time of day. Execution by hanging, like a common criminal. She wondered what charge they would bring against her if they made it public. There had been no trial. When she struggled to speak, the guard laughed. "Trying to defend your honor? Save your breath."
"Kefka,"
she gasped.
"is gun poison."
It was no use. He silenced her with another blow to the face, and she slumped in her chains. Of course he wouldn't listen. Like Kefka hadn't listened. Like Emperor Gestalt hadn't listened. All of them too wrapped up in the glory of the Empire to heed a general gone soft. A general turned traitor. She was born to be a soldier. Raised to be a soldier, had known since her earliest memories that she owed her very existence to the Empire. Honor, she had been taught, came from bringing glory to the Empire, bringing the reach of the Empire to the chaotic, uncivilized masses. Uniting the city-states of the world under a single banner would put an end to their petty squabbles. If a few had to die to keep the rest from killing each other, it was a fair price. They would fare better under Gestalt's boots than at each other's throats. So she was always told. So she had always believed. Kefka's usual violence was necessary to make them surrender more quickly. An unfortunate reality, but a tolerable one. Brief, intense destruction to prevent the ongoing suffering of war. This belief in the righteousness of the Empire did not allow for genocide. Oh, she'd had concerns about the war already. Moving from the military classroom to the battlefield had destroyed some of her illusions about glory and honor and the infallibility of the Emperor's decisions. The sullen faces of the men she commanded came not from resentment of her youth and undeserved authority as she had initially feared, but because many of them had been forcefully conscripted under penalty of death, or had enlisted in the hopes that it would spare their families from starvation. Slowly at first, and then all at once, her conviction that this war was justified began to crumble. The slaughter of Miranda had pushed her over the edge. It was to be her first action as General Celes, the fearsome Magitech knight wielding blade and forbidden arts to bring down her foes, putting into practice years of training her body and her mind. She and her army rode into Miranda, the shining jewel of its continent, Celes on horseback in glittering armor, her hair streaming like a banner behind her. But Miranda barely resisted. And yet Celes had been ordered to make an example of the city.
"You don't have the guts to do it,"
that little voice had said.
"You're supposed to be a military leader, yet here you are, soft and frightened as a little girl. Maybe you should trade your armor for petticoats and play with dolls instead."
Gestalt was her emperor, and she had been raised since birth to fight for him. It was her purpose and her calling. She would be exalted if she did this, praised by her tutors, and all the efforts so many people had devoted to shaping her into a weapon would be justified. The city burned. The surviving men were conscripted, every last one of them, save for the children and the elders. Celes had watched as the men marched off, leaving behind wailing, weeping women, mothers in anguish as their sons were taken from them, lovers heartbroken at being parted. Celes had turned away, willing her heart to stone. She was meant to be a great general, and generals did not take lovers or build families. They were married to their command, their unshaking obligation to the empire and nothing else, loyal unto death. That had been her intended fate, until now. She couldn't say how long she hung semi-conscious in her chains, her whole body aching, her jaw throbbing, her stomach tight and sore despite her careful, shallow breaths. The guards joked to each other, but she didn't register their words.
"You're going to die here,"
the voice said.
"And what will you have accomplished? Slaughtering innocents in Miranda, countless deaths on your hands, and the poisoning of Doma. You haven't saved anyone, not even yourself. Some hero."
One guard left. The other sat watch. But soon enough he nodded off with a bottle in his fist, leaving her to stew alone. She struggled at the chains. No good. Nothing to do but wait. If they had planned this as torture for her, they had calculated it well. Writhing in her own powerlessness, unable to free herself, unable to get through to the guards, knowing that she would die for nothing, and soon others would die too, and all she could do was wait. Blessedly, her consciousness was beginning to blur from pain and hunger and weak blood flow. Maybe she would drift away in the time that remained to her, and it would pass quickly. A key turned in the lock, and the door swung open. The guard who shuffled in was unfamiliar, his gait awkward, as though the heavy boots were new to him. Some green recruit, she guessed, whose helmet and armor had been swapped out by his fellow soldiers as a practical joke, judging by how poorly they fit him. If he got close enough, she could probably throw him off balance, maybe hook her heel around his leg and send him sprawling. What good that would do her, she couldn't say. Another woman might be able to bat her eyelashes, wiggle her hips, whatever other people did to be seductive. Celes had never attempted flirting, let alone seduction. Even the leering she had endured from the guards here was unfamiliar. The recruit let the door swing shut behind him, but he stayed a few paces away as if sizing up the situation, taking in first the sleeping guard with a bottle in his fist, and then Celes herself. And then she realized he was no green soldier, as she got a better look at his face. Fearless, confident, yet not unkind. It was his eyes that caught her attention first, watching her with a quiet intensity that seemed to be listening for something she couldn't hear that he evidently could. There were laugh lines forming at the corners of his eyes already, though he must be only a few years older than her.
"Who are you?"
she asked. He chuckled.
What gave me away?
"That isn't your armor, and you don't act like a soldier."
As if conceding defeat, he removed his helmet and wiped the back of one half-gloved hand over his sweaty forehead. He was handsome, she supposed, if a little disheveled. A mop of gray-blonde hair barely contained by a patterned bandana, a mouth that looked comfortable smiling, and those sharp eyes.
My name is Locke Cole. I'm with the returners.
She stiffened.
"Isn't it a little late for an assassination? They're executing me tomorrow anyway. Kill me tonight and you'll just spare me the humiliation."
See, and that's why I'm here.
He said thoughtfully, conversationally.
Why on earth would the Empire be executing one of its own generals without even a trial?
"Treason."
Really?
His eyebrows rose, but his voice was mild.
Are you thinking about defecting then? We wouldn't say no to some intelligence if you're so inclined.
"Kefka is planning genocide,"
she said flatly, cutting him off. He inhaled sharply through his teeth at her words, but she continued, all of it pouring out in a cold, bitter tumble.
He's going to poison the besieged kingdom of Doma if he's not stopped. Emperor Gestahl wouldn't believe me, and he did not approve when I took action to stop it myself.
What did you do?
I tried to kill Kafka.
There was a moment of silence, and then Locke snorted in dark amusement.
It's a shame you didn't succeed.
His face was grim, as though her confession had meant something to him. She almost wanted to laugh with relief at being believed at last, at somebody listening, and, she hoped, taking action.
Will you tell your people? Will you make sure they stop him somehow? Please, someone has to.
No.
He said, and she opened her mouth to protest, to scream at him if she had to beg. But he stepped toward her, his expression resolute.
You are going to tell them, and then we are going to stop him, if you're in any shape to fight.
I'm to be executed at dawn.
We'll see about that.
He pulled a pin from the bandana wrapped around his shaggy hair, then snapped it in half with leverage between his teeth, a fluid, confident motion.
It's a handy trick,
he said, with a slight smile.
It's got me out of trouble a few times.
You're freeing an enemy soldier?
You were willing to die to try to stop your own people from committing a war crime. I don't think we're enemies.
With practiced ease, he scraped the rust from her chains and then fiddled around with his pin in the locks. She winced as the shackles rubbed over the raw skin of her wrists.
Sorry,
he said.
We'll bandage those up once you're free.
Why are you doing this?
I like rescuing people,
he said with a laugh. It sounded self-deprecating, like this was some kind of private joke.
Anyway, Bannon will want to hear this, and you'll be able to explain it better yourself than I could.
What if I'm lying?
You have no reason to lie.
This could be a setup.
A ridiculously involved one with little chance of success.
He wiggled the pin again until the lock gave a satisfying click. He released the shackle around her left wrist, then turned his attention to the second.
For someone about to be executed, you're awfully determined to ruin any rescue attempt.
I'm your enemy,
she protested.
I'm an Imperial general.
You were an Imperial general, but you're not my enemy, I told you that.
He gave the chain one more pull, freeing her second wrist. Her arms dropped heavily to her sides, and the world spun. She swayed. He reached to steady her, his hands gripping her shoulders, and he peered closer at her face, concerned.
Can you stand?
I think so.
Well, let's get you out of here before Sleeping Beauty over there wakes up.
She looked nothing like he would have expected. He had imagined her older, gruffer, coarse, and quick to anger. She led the butchery of Miranda, after all, an attack so quick and brutal it had cowed many of the city-states on both continents, who took it to heart as a warning against resistance. He thought he might hate that woman if he met her for the suffering she had caused so many. He had never imagined this slender young woman, bruised and battered and burned, willingly inviting her own death if it meant she had a chance to save others, to save people who should technically be her enemies, innocent though they might be. She looked innocent herself, a victim of unwarranted violence. She wore only a thin white shift, stained and torn, that did little to cover her lithe figure, and he couldn't help wondering just how the Empire had punished her. Regardless, her spirit was clearly unbroken, at least. He would coax the rest out of her, and then see if someone at headquarters could tend to her. The guard was out cold, and Locke took the liberty of relieving the man of his pants and boots, which he handed over to Celes. She accepted them without comment, or even the look of disgust he might have expected. Soon enough, she was as dressed as she was going to be, her wounds tended as well as he could manage with a field kit, and wounded she was, with crusted blood and spreading bruises, and even the blisters of a burn along one arm. He dabbed the open wounds with medicine to numb the pain and hasten the healing, then wrapped them with bandages. She looked almost like a Narcian, her arms nearly covered in fabric.
That's all I can do for now,
he said. She glanced toward the door, and he couldn't help wondering if she were in shock, as pale as she was and as little as she seemed to register her own pain.
The next guard will be coming soon.
We'll be gone before they have the chance to sound the alarm.
He led her out into the hall. To his right, the hallway bent around toward the cellar staircase and up into the house proper. Wall sconces illuminated that direction brightly. Locke turned instead to his left, where the hallway dead-ended into a set of doors much like the one they had just passed through. He paused in front of them, trying to summon up his mental directions. The room on the left or straight ahead? Behind him, Celes took slow, careful steps, limping in her stolen boots. Straight ahead. That had to be the answer, given the layout of the town.
This way,
He said, unlocking that door with the same key he'd used to enter her cell. Then, for good measure, he unlocked the surrounding doors. Might as well not raise suspicion about any one particular room, should the guards think to check for them here. Celes watched him closely, but she didn't challenge him, even if she was thinking it. Her unspoken questions followed him through the center door. Inside, the room was pitch black. He tugged Edgar's mechanical lantern out of his satchel and flicked it on, illuminating dusty stacks of boxes, rolled carpets and wall hangings, forgotten chairs, and other bric-a-brac that filled the room. Celes let out a wordless sound of surprise and confusion at the light, which he found almost irrationally entertaining. It made him feel like a magician pulling things from his bag of tricks. That feeling only intensified when he snooped around the far wall, which was covered with glossy wood paneling, and found a little latch that sprung a nearly invisible trapdoor. The passageway beyond was narrow, with a low ceiling, and just as dark as the storeroom had been.
You've been here before,
Celes said.
Not exactly.
He said.
I have an extremely good memory for maps and diagrams. I used to go spelunking as a hobby. It was useful then. Still is, really.
You're telling me you have a map of secret passageways under someone's house in the middle of South Figaro?
She sounded skeptical, maybe even joking, if she was capable of telling a joke, but if she knew how close to the truth she was.
You'd be surprised.
He couldn't help grinning as he ducked through the doorway and gestured for her to follow him into the narrow brick passage. Damn, but he loved this town. Provided he lived long enough to retire, and the Empire had been sent packing, or better still, eradicated entirely, he might want to retire here. One of Locke's favorite things about South Figaro was its tenacity. It had started as a temporary way station for explorers from Figaro proper a few generations ago. Somehow it had grown into a full-fledged city that politely requested its independence from Figaro Castle, and Figaro, not being run by imperialists or fascists, agreed to let it go. It had a colorful and storied history, most of which Locke only knew at the most basic level, but what he did know was that it had the stubbornness and resourcefulness to survive anything. Fire, treachery, illness, invasion, no matter what happened, the people of South Figaro pulled together and rebuilt. Some slightly paranoid but still brilliant ancestor of Edgar's had decided the town should have a system of underground passages connecting many of the major buildings so that the citizens could band together in the event of attack or emergency. The residents never bothered removing them, and in fact the full network of passages was not well known to most citizens. Take, for example, the hidden passage in this rich man's basement. The man himself had bought the home some years before, and Locke doubted he knew about any of this. Rich people, in Locke's experience, were either obsessively prone to studying their investments or couldn't be bothered to put in the effort. This rich man had inherited his wealth and sold his city out to the Empire, which meant he was greedy and gullible and likely fell in the latter camp. Locke had known about these passages for years. They had made his life infinitely easier over the past few days, as he snuck through the city taking inventory of the Imperial presence, looking for opportunities to disrupt the Empire's supply lines, and making note of where and how to smuggle help to the people of South Figaro if they rose up in rebellion. The passages had their limitations. Some had been walled up or fallen into disrepair, but their usefulness could not be overstated. The passage's low ceiling gave him only an inch or so of headroom. Anyone tall would have had to stoop to fit down here. Fortunately, in this case anyway, Locke was not an especially tall man, and while Celes was nearly his height, that meant she too cleared the ceiling with relative ease. Because his electric torch was the only light down here, Celes followed very closely behind him, her breathing somewhat unsteady. He could see her hand beside him tracing the wall. The tactile sensation of it was probably reassuring for her if she had little experience being underground like this. He had certainly passed through less hospitable tunnels himself. caves with sloping ceilings and irregular walls that could become impassable without warning, that he had crawled into on hands and knees and had to back out of in the same undignified manner when he could go no further forward. There was sometimes a certain sense of excitement to the danger of the unknown, but he was glad for the relative safety of these man-made paths.
How are you holding up?
He asked after they'd walked in silence for a considerable amount of time. He looked over his shoulder at her. There wasn't much room for him to turn around. Her head was down as though she was looking at her feet, and she still kept a hand splayed on the wall.
I'm fine,
she said. She sounded winded, and more than that, she sounded anxious, her voice tight and closely held. Not fine. But he couldn't blame her for putting forth a facade given the circumstances.
It shouldn't be much longer,
he said, taking his internal monologue and verbalizing it for her sake.
When we get above ground, we'll have to see where we end up. There might be guards around. There are a lot of guards in town, just generally making a nuisance of themselves, though luckily not much more than a nuisance from what I've seen. So we'll need to avoid them and get through or over the north wall into the forest. With any luck, we'll give them the slip and we'll be camping under the stars as easy as can be.
The light flickered. Oh, shit, he thought. He fiddled with it a little, keeping his voice calm as he continued describing whatever came to mind. But no matter what he did, the flickering continued, which meant he had just a minute or two before the light clicked off with a little hissing sigh. Pitch darkness enclosed them. It was absolute and sudden and claustrophobic. Behind him, Celes swallowed a whimper.
Easy,
he said calmly.
I've done this before, right? I've just told you all about it. This is nothing to worry about, just a straight shot down a hallway that was designed specifically for us to walk safely down it. It's like sneaking out of your bedroom to the kitchen in the middle of the night and not wanting to wake anyone up. Just that safe. Nothing's going to happen to us. Here's what you're going to do.
He put every bit of reassurance he could into his words, every bit of confidence and warmth. It helped that he genuinely believed they were safe down here, but he had put on false confidence to talk someone through situations when he was much less confident and much more afraid himself.
Don't think about that. Don't think about her. Just breathe,
he thought.
First, put your hands on my shoulders. We're almost the same height, so that shouldn't be too hard. Just lift your hands to touch your own shoulders, then move them forward. I'm right here.
After a few seconds, he felt her fingertips on his shoulders, a gentle touch that immediately withdrew like the contact had startled her. Then her fingers rested on his shoulders again. They were shaking.
Don't be afraid to hold tight if you need to,
he said.
It'll help me know that you're still there too.
Her fingers gripped his shoulders more firmly. Long, slender, bony fingers, very unlike the soft ones that had held his shoulders like this before, years ago, a lifetime ago. But her hands stopped trembling after a few moments, and he heard her take a deep breath very close behind him.
Now, close your eyes,
he said.
It's all right if you can't see anything because your eyes are closed. Keep them squeezed tight, and don't worry. I'll get us out of this.
It was frankly painful to be in this moment with this familiarity. In the dark, she could be anyone. They could be anywhere. He could, if he let himself, imagine for just a few seconds that he had stepped backward in time to a memory, to terror he couldn't let her know, to being the steady one, because it had been his fault they were in that situation at all, and then the giddy relief and almost hysterical laughter when they emerged into a wider cave with light filtering from high above, and a magnificent cathedral ceiling dripping with stalactites, and Rachel had clapped her hands with delight, and he spun her while she laughed.
Left foot,
he said, stepping forward with his left foot.
Right foot.
She stumbled at first, but he started humming a melody and shifting his shoulders against her hands in time with the music, and soon enough she fell into the rhythm, and they moved together through the lightless hallway. With his left hand he touched the wall, keeping himself grounded and making sure they were going in a straight line with no branches. Eventually the hallway seemed to be sloping upwards until at last it ended in another smooth bricked wall. He felt along the wall with the flat of his hand until he found the lever handle. He tugged it down and felt a wash of relief as the door mechanism clicked. The light, by contrast with so much darkness, hurt his eyes. The air smelled sweet. He almost tumbled out of the hallway into a shaded, covered alcove between buildings. A step along the entire face of the wall made it likely that no one would place anything in front of the secret door out of ignorance or malice. Forethought he appreciated. He held a hand toward Celes to help her down if she needed balance, but she supported herself against the wall. While he closed the secret door as quietly and carefully as he could, she sat down on the step beside it and stared blankly ahead, hands in her lap. It was difficult to tell what her reaction was, but she seemed all right for the moment. How long had they been down there? 15-20 minutes at most, but long enough for Celes' absence to be discovered and for word to begin to spread. Best to assume the guards would be suspicious looking for her.
I'll be right back,
he said. Celes had looked the possibility of death in the face without flinching for years. Yet she was disturbed by just how terrified she had felt down there in the dark.
This must be what hell is like,
she had thought, and hated herself for her weakness, as though she were a child scared of shadows in the corner of the room. Maybe it was just the cumulative effect of days of anticipating her own execution, the physical ordeal they had inflicted on her, the horrors she had imagined, the horrors she had witnessed and been culpable in. She felt drained. There was something almost uncomfortably intimate about the way he had reassured her through the darkness. Not just the physical touch, although she couldn't remember the last time she had touched someone in any way that was not violent, sparring, or deadly combat, so that was certainly unusual. But also the warm, comforting gentleness in his voice. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. She was a general, disgraced or not. She was a soldier. Yet he had spoken to her like he was soothing a child, and she, damn it all, had been soothed. When he said he would scope out the situation, she obeyed his command to stay put. She would be recognized and apprehended if they saw her. She didn't know the town. She was utterly exhausted, a wet rag wrung out and tossed in the corner, spent. He returned not much later, his expression thoughtful, frowning.
There's soldiers up ahead,
he said.
3 of them.
He unsheathed one of the daggers at his waist and held it out to her.
Do you think you could fight with this?
She sized it up.
It's not ideal, but yes.
He looked dubious, doubting her skill with the weapon or doubting her stamina. If the latter, she had to admit she shared his uncertainty.
Can you do this without killing them, if it's possible?
She laughed ruefully. Her reputation had preceded her.
Yes.
It would certainly be more efficient or effective to just kill the guards and leave their bodies cooling in the waning sunlight. No one would notice they were missing for some time, and even then, no one would be able to say with certainty whether Celes had been responsible. And there would be absolutely no indication that anyone had facilitated her escape, no possible accomplice witnessed and reported. It would be the safest decision. And yet she was relieved Locke had made it clear that he wished to avoid bloodshed. The alcove they found themselves in had 2 exits, one visibly blocked by junk and the other seemingly clear. Celes followed Locke as he prowled, cat-like and confident, down the remaining pathway. At least it was dusk, and most of the residents had turned in. But the guards Locke had mentioned were stationed in a cluster down the street, and there would be no avoiding them, nor would waiting longer do any good, giving the troops time to mobilize and plan a strategy to flush her out. Locke seemed to know where he was going, and he walked without any apparent awareness of the guards, like he had nothing to hide. If he hadn't been accompanied by a known criminal, he might have been able to avoid suspicion altogether, but instead, a voice called out behind them.
Hey, you there!
Locke kept going as though he had heard nothing. Celes stayed at his heels, following his lead.
That's General Celes. I demand that you stop!
Locke sped up, just shy of a run, and Celes followed suit, though her legs screamed a protest. This wasn't going to work. She couldn't keep up with Locke, not in her current condition, and the guards were gaining on them. She spun to face them as they approached, raising Locke's dagger and shifting into a ready stance. It took Locke a moment to realize what was happening and draw his remaining dagger. But he wasn't a soldier, wasn't a warrior. She could see it in how he carried himself, in the muscles of his body built for speed and agility, not power. This was not his fight. She could end it quickly, without involving him. Fighting 3-on-1 would have been more challenging if they had been officers, but these were just a cluster of unfortunate recruits. Even with the handicap of an unfamiliar weapon and a battered, weak body, she still made short work of them. They tried to surround her. She danced easily between them, dodging their pitiful swipes, stomping their legs, slashing at the weak points where armor didn't shield them. They were like children, and she was a deadly tornado of violence and death. Wielding a dagger meant fighting at closer range than she preferred, but she bared her teeth and struck again and again until they backed away and stood out of reach, uncertain, their conviction clearly wavering as they considered what exactly was facing them. Her breaths came quick and shallow and harsh, and she hoped it made her sound like a dangerous animal and not like she might topple at any moment if this continued.
If you walk away now, I won't chase you,
she said in a low voice. One of the soldiers stepped forward, sword raised, though there was a quaver in his voice.
You're under arrest for treason to the Empire.
Brave and foolish and entirely unnecessary. Celes threw herself at him, ducked away from his too-late attack, and raised the edge of her blade to his throat before he could back away.
This is my final warning. Walk away now and I will let you live. Or...
She pressed the dagger into his flesh.
I will disembowel you and your compatriots, and I will walk out the front gate, and none of you will be able to stop me. Do you understand?
The whites of the man's bulging eyes were visible.
Yes, General.
Go,
she said, lowering the blade an inch. When he didn't move, she barked out again.
Go!
That seemed to break the spell. The man ran, glancing back over his shoulder twice before he had cleared the end of the street and was out of sight. His companions were a few seconds behind him, but they, too, fled. Celes flipped the dagger around and offered it hilt out to Locke, who was staring at her. She couldn't tell if she saw fear, horror, or disgust on his face. Then his expression smoothed out, and he accepted the dagger and resheathed it.
Even my own men didn't follow me because they were loyal to me,
she said.
They followed me because they were told to, and because they believed I could take on anything. They never loved me, but they do fear me.
Locke shrugged noncommittally with a faint smile.
I hope it won't be a disappointment to you that we won't be going through the front gate.
Yes, I know,
she said.
That was the point.
He chuckled, low in his throat.
Ah, misdirection. Very good.
They did not, in fact, go through the front gate. As effectively as Celes had managed to scare them, and it was an impressive sight, he had expected he would need to defend her, only to find himself rendered utterly useless as she tore through the guards' defenses without hesitation. It would only be a matter of time before the soldiers reported the incident and something more vicious came after them. So Locke led her through a series of side streets into shops and outback doors, occasionally waving an apologetic greeting to a shopkeep or resident before hurrying onward. This technique seemed to be quite an effective one for avoiding guards, as they reached the very edge of town without another incident, thank goodness. His heart lifted. He could see the forest at the edge of town from here, and once they'd slipped into the woods, especially with the falling night, he could get them to safety. Heavily armed soldiers couldn't move effectively through the close-set trees, and Locke knew the woods well enough to get by. And then the caves, and the countryside, and finally the Narsh Mountains. He had made this trek so many times that even an injured companion wouldn't be an insurmountable problem. The worst was behind them. Except that just as he had started to celebrate the inevitability of success, an incontestable harbinger of failure crashed through the alleyway behind them and leveled its guns at Celes' head. The soldier at the controls didn't even bother with a speech or a demand for surrender. He flipped a series of switches in his Magitech armor and the guns started to glow, threatening impending fire. At this point-blank range, there was no chance of dodging or fleeing or doing much of anything except saying a prayer. Regret knotted in his stomach. What would become of Rachel now? Would she fade away after all? That was what he thought of in his final moments. Her beautiful, lifeless face, all hope extinguished. Celes swept in front of him, some final gesture of heroism that seemed in keeping with his impression of her so far, as though she could absorb the blast for him and he would live, instead of it obliterating them both. She raised her hands toward the Magitech armor, palms out, fingers touching. Around her, the air took on a peculiar tingling sensation Locke had experienced exactly once before, when the impossible had been made real by another young woman. The temperature plummeted. The skin on Celes's hands turned white, etched with traces of frost. A moment later, ice crusted over the surface of the Magitech armor, and then Celes snapped her fingers, and shards of ice from nowhere beat a jagged percussion as they speared through the armor's metal casing into its technological heart. The armor sparked and sputtered, and then it began to emit a high-pitched whine.
That doesn't sound good.
Locke observed. He tugged on Celes's sleeve.
Come on, we need to get out of here, now.
Finally, they were on their way to safety. There was just enough light from the rising moon to see by as they fled into the forest. With the city growing dim and distant behind them, and the sound of the Magitech armor fading away under the hum of singing insects, he started to breathe more easily. A permanent carpet of leaves softened their footsteps. The air smelled damp and green and wonderful. Locke loved cities, genuinely loved surrounding himself with people, but there was something about stepping inside a forest and away from civilization. Behind him, he could hear Celes breathing heavily, and he slowed and turned to face her, though it meant walking backwards.
Are you all right?
You took that better than I would have expected.
I've seen magic before,
he said carefully.
Magitech, yes, of course, but...
Her eyes narrowed.
Terra? It couldn't, but... No, I suppose it could. I heard she'd escaped. She found her way to the returners?
Something like that? You know her?
She was silent. Well, clearly she did, though she didn't seem inclined to talk about it. He ran through what he knew about Terra, that she had been enslaved by the Empire, that she had been hurt by Kefka and forced to murder their own soldiers to prove some sick, twisted point, and what he knew about Celes, that she had turned on Kefka, and that she pointedly didn't seem to want to murder civilians. There were clear overlaps. Presumably a shared hatred of Kefka, but who didn't hate that psychopathic clown, really? Magic, though, that was significant and rare, and an unquestionable connection between the two young women. They kept walking. He let her have her space, though he couldn't help wondering what was going through her thoughts. Magic seemed to have taken what was left of her energy, or maybe it was just that she had finally reached the end of her admittedly considerable reserves, as she was even shakier on her feet than before. He wanted to take this at a kinder pace, to give her time to rest, but the guards would follow them. So he pushed them harder than he would have liked. For her part, she made no complaints, even when she stumbled or swayed, or was visibly winded.
We've got to keep going,
he said apologetically.
If they decide to take your jailbreak seriously, they might send dogs after us, and that will be hard to evade if we're still in the woods. We have to press on for as long as it takes to reach the caves.
She nodded, though she was pale, pallid even, and sweat beaded on her forehead. Eventually, though, he realized they needed to stop and rest. It would be impossible to expect her to keep going like this. She still pressed on without a word. It was only after the third time he had to catch her arm to keep her from falling over branches that he himself could easily avoid, that he realized she wasn't going to tell him if she couldn't continue. But she very clearly could go no further. He glanced behind them, through the thick maze of trees and undergrowth. He could neither see nor hear any sign of pursuit.
There's a stream just over this hill,
he said.
We're going to stop there.
But you said...
In a perfect world, we'd keep marching straight on till midnight,
he said with an easy smile, walking beside her so that he could support her if she stumbled again.
Unfortunately, that would probably mean we're automatons, which we're not, for better or for worse. It's almost night. They won't see us.
Climbing that final hill was brutal, even for him, at the end of a long, long day. But there was the stream, glinting in the dim light, burbling in a gentle, murmuring voice that soothed his heart. He settled on the far bank, set his pack down, and dropped beside it with a sigh of relief.
I'd love to be able to offer a tent or even a bedroll, but I packed light on this trip and we haven't made it to any of my stashes.
She sat down a pace or two away, letting out a breath between her teeth.
Stashes?
This is a trip I make often. I keep gear in a few places in case I need it. We'll be glad for it when we get to the caves tomorrow.
That's clever.
She stretched her arms over her head, rolled out her neck, her shoulders. Her joints creaked and popped stiffly.
Don't worry about me. I think I could sleep on concrete tonight.
It won't be good for your injuries.
I don't care,
she said simply.
Push me as hard as you need to and I'll manage. What matters is getting to the returners as fast as possible, if you think they'll listen about Doma.
They should.
Good.
That confirmed a few things. That he would need to be mindful of her physical limitations because she wouldn't. That she was single-mindedly intent on this mission. He respected her tenacity, even if it might mean extra effort to work around it.
I have to ask.
He hesitated, considering his words.
About Miranda.
She winced. The first time he had really seen her wince, as though this pained her more than her wounds.
This is why I said I'm your enemy.
Why Miranda, not Doma?
Miranda was a mistake,
she said, looking away.
It didn't need to happen. Not like that. Maybe not at all.
She rubbed at her wrist through the bandages, made a face, dropped it.
I was told we were preventing wars by occupying the city-states. Bring them all under one roof, so to speak, and then there would be peace. Before Miranda, I was still trying to believe it. But even if that were true...
Did you want to be an Imperial soldier?
That made her stare at him, puzzled, maybe perturbed.
I was never really in a position to consider an alternative.
Something about her expression on such a young face made him think of Tara. The green-haired girl had seemed tormented by half-remembered nightmares of violence she had been forced to inflict. Was Celes likewise haunted? She fell asleep before she had even had a chance to eat or drink or wash her wounds. Locke sat with his back against a tree, listening to her sleeping murmurs. The Empire had been cruel to the rest of the world, bringing destruction and suffering everywhere it set foot. But had it been any less cruel to its own people? This young woman had been an Imperial general, a high-ranking official by any standard, yet the wounds in her seemed much, much older and deeper than what could be seen with the eye. The Empire had been cruel to the rest of the world, bringing destruction and suffering everywhere it set foot. But had it been any less cruel to its own people? Every day seemed to introduce new reasons to hate the Empire, new reasons why it must be stopped, before any more lives could be claimed, before any more souls could be so damaged.